with for now over a decade. So my purpose of this talk is to kind of address a couple of questions, and I do want to kind of lay the ground for that in the very beginning, which is that as Professor Pungodi mentioned, I work on popular cinema and its intersection with technology and informality. So I will talk about my research towards the end because I do want to show how I use methods, I mix methods in my own research. So I'll use that as a case study. But broadly, I want to address the question of film studies as a field head on in this particular discussion. And the reason for that is since it is a department of English and foreign languages, I'm guessing that faculty have varied interests and a lot of the training is in traditional film and languages, right? Languages and linguistics and those areas. So I am taking that into account, and therefore the first half of my discussion will focus on the specific language needs of the discipline and the evolution of the discipline in terms of how it has started to, for the last 2-3 decades, shift the focus from textual analysis to a more mixed methods approach, besides focusing on questions of film theory. And the second half, I will talk about specifically the kind of sources and methods that have been used in this transition. And I'll give examples from existing research and then finally look at my own approach to research as a way to kind of bring the conversation forward. So that's what I've planned. And before I kind of go into the details of that, I do want to mention that my own training, I feel like, is a part of the story that will set the tone for this. And so I was a literature student. So I come from a school or a department like yours, where I was trained in literature and took classes on linguistics and languages, but also like focused primarily on English literature at Miranda House. And while I was studying there, I got the traditional cultural studies training, right, where we understand the intersections between theory, we look at philosophy, history, and we understand how we can engage with these words, these basically works of art through that cultural studies lens. But something for my own journey changed, which is that I took a class on visual studies during my master's. It was one of the courses offered at the arts faculty in Delhi University where I studied. And that course really got me interested in visual language, right? And part of that engagement was that written words engage with storytelling in one kind of way, but audiovisual, and at this point only visual form, has a very different language. I had to now not just pay attention to the meter and the words and its kind of lineage. I now had to think about color, I had to think about contrast, I had to think about questions of how much of the screen is blank, where is the lighting coming from, what kind of story is being told in a static art form. And that got me interested in the visual art, so to say. And from there, my journey started and took me to JNU, School of Arts and Aesthetics, where cinema studies was a discipline. And this was the first time I was introduced to a discipline called cinema studies or film studies. And that was really eye-opening because I realized that while a lot of what I had learned through my disciplinary lens of English literature was really, really useful for me. But at the same time, I had to really learn a new language. So the next part of my academic journey was to do part of, retaining the knowledge I had built in the departments which were focusing on literature and expanding that onto departments that would broadly define themselves as film studies or media studies. And that took me for my PhD to University of Texas at Austin, where I got a doctorate in media studies. And I will talk about the importance of this because disciplinary shifts point to shifts in research methodologies and research styles as well. So I will talk about the birth of cinema as an object of study in English departments. It's moved to becoming a field of its own, like film studies and screen studies, and then now eventually its focus on media studies, broadly speaking. So that's what I'm going to do, and I will talk about some of my own research and how it includes all of these different kinds of trainings and methods as I look at questions of media. All right. So I want to first start with like a question as to how does one research films, right? How does one really, what is there to research in a film? And I teach at Flame courses on film, television, new media, screen cultures, and very often students sign up for courses like this thinking that it'll be very entertaining. We'll just watch films and we'll talk about films. And I feel that in the field of like research, again, film might not be a form that is taken very seriously at times. It is a very unique art form within the broad cultural studies framework. It allows us to analyze both the text, the context, but at the same time focus on this as a very specialized industrial production, right? So there are a couple of things that I want to kind of mention here, which is that film is a very unique audio-visual language. It is different from alphabet. It is different from written word. It's different from spoken word. It is in order to meaningfully engage in film scholarship, one has to understand the language of film, which means language such as mise en scène. What does that mean? How does lighting play a role? Terminologies like low-key lighting versus high-key lighting. Conversations on camera work and how it helps construct perspective, the importance of set design, the importance of some of these key elements form the language element. Just out of curiosity, how many people who are here write on films? So no one? Is there general interest in film?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so nobody does film
Yes, madam.
studies, however.
I do write on films from time to time. I've got a few papers.
Okay, so you do write on films. Do you have training in film studies or?
Mhm. No, 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 not at all. So
No.
we'll talk about it sometimes once your talk is done, maybe. So
Oh, sure. Yeah, I think so. So that's helpful for me to know because I want to know that maybe I'm not going too foundational here and talking about something that's not that's like too basic. So I just want to make sure that the distinction of like the kind of language we use in talking about film is kind of underscored here. So that's one, that it's an audio visual language which is very distinct, and in order to meaningfully engage in film research and film analysis, both depending on what your focus areas are, and sometimes of course they come together. We need to know what that audiovisual language is. We need to be able to identify that language and speak meaningfully, engaging with what this medium entails. The second thing about film that makes it different and distinct to research is that it's a very powerful mass medium, as opposed to literature where literacy is assumed, where the question of you knowing the language and therefore accessing it is part of the discussion. I'm here not thinking about translations or adaptations. That is a larger debate, but that still requires you to kind of think about one language versus another language. Film, however, goes beyond the bounds of literacy and instead is able to cater to a larger audience as long as the language itself is accessible. And if our history has anything to teach us, we can still watch films by Charlie Chaplin or Buster Keaton, the silent era films, without really knowing the language or the intertitles. And the reason is that the audiovisual form does so much of the work of telling us what's happening on screen that we don't really need language that much, or at least the written language that much. So it's a very powerful medium because of that, because of the number of people it's able to reach, because it's not tied to that. and also because it's considered to be a form which is steeped in the question of like leisure and people and suspension of disbelief, and it has potential, of course, as we know, for both propaganda and revolution. So cinema is a very powerful form because it really hides its language well, and there's a lot that goes into that. And the third thing that I want to mention, that how does one really research film, that one needs to keep in mind is that film, as opposed to book or painting or sculpture or poem, novel, all of those art forms, film is actually a collaborative art, which means whose film is it? There's an auteur theory based on that, but whose film, who's the author and who's the owner and who's the person who's really the creator of the film is really complicated question, because you need an army of people to make a film. You need someone to handle the camera, to do editing, you need someone who's managing light, you need actors to act, you need scriptwriters to write. There's so many creative elements to filmmaking, and while directors are at the helm, it is a collaborative art at the end of the day, and it is a technological art, which I'll talk about in some more detail later. And it's part of a massive industry. So keeping all of this in mind, we cannot be using the research style and methods and language that we employ in studying languages or literature in order to study film. So this is what I'm going to address. I'm going to talk about film and its evolution. I've already mentioned that, the broad areas of study and the scientific research and methods in film studies within the broad framework. And in order to kind of address that question, I want to talk about the fact that film is very often part of departments like yours. Film was actually born in English departments in the 1950s, 1960s in the US, 1970s and 80s in India, and it continues to do so, as you are all witness to the fact that a lot of people who work in languages and literature departments very often write on film, but so do departments on sociology, anthropology, communication. There are different departments that teach and work on film. So as you think about film research, I want you to think about these intersections, because I will make the assertion that film in and by itself as a medium requires multidisciplinary approach, and it is interdisciplinary in nature. So as opposed to disciplines which say interdisciplinarity makes for a more nuanced understanding of that area, I would argue in case of film, you can't but do interdisciplinary research, because otherwise it doesn't really create the depth that one needs to really call it a film research. So that's something I want to mention very clearly here. And by the 1980s and 1990s, film departments start to emerge, which is an offshoot of a lot of the English language departments. And Textual analysis is one of the most common methods, and I think that's something that a lot of you might be more familiar with. I'm sure some of your students want to write papers, analytical essays focusing on film as a visual text, but primarily also thinking about the literary long form storytelling and applying the principles that they apply to books and literature, and use and apply it to the audiovisual medium. And there is nothing wrong in doing film analysis and textual analysis. Film analysis and textual analysis, broadly speaking, uses the cultural studies lens. It looks at film as a historical, social, political text that has a lot of meaning, and you can kind of look at that meaning, and the fact that film, when it started as a medium, was borrowing a lot from literature, graphic art, but also was borrowing from theater, was borrowing from all these different art forms, is important to signpost here. So film analysis or textual analysis, I'm guessing a lot of you are more familiar with, where questions of genre, tropes, conventions, representational focus, and historical documentation becomes one of the standard ways in which film can be studied. Of course, that's changing with films on Netflix like Bandersnatch. I don't know if anyone's familiar with this, but this is an offshoot of a television show called Black Mirror, and they actually did what is called gamification of film, which means films on platforms now are a part of interactive media, and you can't even understand how to engage with this media unless you think about questions of technology, think about how this technology is engaging with other art forms such as video games, photography, architecture, design, and so on and so forth. So I want to mention that because film studies now in the last I would say 10 to 15 years has taken this turn where it's not just looking at film as a distinct art form, but is also thinking about film itself changing. In fact, I ask my students all the time how many of them watch films in theaters, and a lot of them actually watched films on their laptops. So that's a sign of the field again changing, and this intersection is something we need to keep in mind as we think about questions of research. That are we only looking at film as a text? Are we doing a disservice to thinking about questions of platform? Where are we watching it? Who's watching it? In what mode are we watching it? Is it a single viewing? Is it a communal viewing? So those questions have really shifted in film research in the last few years. I want to make sure I'm on time. Yeah. Uh, so the AR, VR, AI is creating a whole new context to this visual text and textual analysis. But one of the foundational things that one can understand when it comes to film is that film theory is really at the heart of film analysis. So if you are interested in doing film analysis, which I would say is a very traditional approach to film research, and you can still continue to do that, and a lot of film scholars today uh, integrate film analysis into larger research on an era, history, labor practices, industry, structures, etc., star studies. So film analysis has not left film research. It has been integrated and become a part of how you tell that story. But if you are interested in either integrating it largely or doing it on its own, we need to really think about the origins of film theory. And I don't think, because this is theory and not so much on methods, so I will not spend too much time on it, but I do want to mention that film theory was one of the first ways in which we think about film research. But I would say it's not necessarily research, it's more of analysis. It's like textual analysis again, but taking into account that film is a very distinct art form again. So there's apparatus theory, and if you teach any classes on theory in your classes, I would highly encourage you to include some of these theories in your classroom teaching for students to be able to mobilize and understand how film as an audiovisual form uses its own apparatus to engage with some of these larger theoretical frameworks. So I mentioned some here: apparatus theory, which looks at the state apparatus and its impact on cinema viewing and meaning making. Feminist film theory includes questions of male gaze. Laura Mulvey's foundational essay on male gaze in narrative film, where she looks at how women are looked at in cinema and how camera assumes the eye of the director as a male director, but also the audience sitting in the theater as male audience. So Laura Mulvey's work on the male gaze is really important, and a lot of film scholars have engaged with that, which comes under the feminist film theory. Her discussion on the male gaze and the camera apparatus being used in order to objectify women and present them in a passive state is one of the ways in which we can think about how theory is used for analysis and to discuss politics of representation. There are similar other theories: Marxist theory, queer film theory, film genre theory, and about how genres are ritualized and how audience expects films to have a very particular kind of narrative arc where the problem is resolved by the end and everything is happy. And as you leave the theater, popular cinema gives you a sense of catharsis, which real life doesn't necessarily offer. And what are the implications, ideological implications of something like that? So film theory is really a very important kind of step for us to really understand the dynamics of canonical film writing, but also really understand the way in which the medium and the art form has evolved and has been analyzed and understood. So this is one thing that continues to inform film research and will remain important for quite a while. I think that's not going anywhere for sure. And this includes specific Indian cinema theories like darshan theory, examples of Tamil fans of Tamil and Telugu fans of like Rajnikant's films, how temples are constructed for film stars. S.V. Srinivas has really interesting work on going to exhibition spaces and then the sense of the star emerging on screen. So this includes, star studies and celebrity studies and aspects like that. So that's something I want to signpost. And I want to mention two foundational texts that engage with something like this more head on, and that is Madhav Prasad's book on ideology of Hindi cinema, Hindi film, and then Indian cinema in the time of celluloid from Bollywood to emergency. This was the beginning, and then this text is then read by film scholars like Bindu Menon, who looks at Malayalam cinema. It's been looked by S.V. Srinivas, who looks at Tamil cinema and Telugu cinema, and many other scholars who basically used some of these foundational texts to kind of think about cultural studies approach to film. I also want to mention that I'm a cultural studies scholar, so I'm not talking about quantitative research in this talk. I'm going to focus primarily on humanistic approach to film studies. I'm going to primarily talk about cultural studies approach, but there is a quantitative element to film research as well. I hope I'm not doing a disservice to your group in case someone does quantitative studies, but that's a totally different ballgame. So I'm not going to talk about that today. So this is part of what is now called like the formal analysis, right? Like to do formal analysis in film. And in order to formal analysis in film, you need to understand film language. You need to understand the implicit and explicit meanings created in film, and kind of then link it with the cultural studies approach of like representation, gender, etc. And in order to do that, I would recommend that if you're interested in formal analysis and if you're interested in textual analysis and discourse analysis, those three big, large umbrella terms in terms of film research, that you verse yourself in the language of film and storytelling deeply. One part of it I've already spoken about, which is film theory. The other part of it is film language. And film language, I mean, sorry, one more question. Do you have any courses on film in your department at this point? Or that deal with film in any peripheral way?
No, ma'am. No, ma'am, because we are teaching first year of BTech students. We
Yes,
don't have.
you don't have. But
Yeah.
do you have any courses on communication theory? Do you have courses on
We have communicative English, and if
okay.
the student, if a research scholar is doing a research on film studies or media studies, they'll be having coursework based on that.
Okay, so that's a separate kind
Yes,
of
ma'am.
track.
Separate. Yes.
Got it. So then I think it might be worth that I spend 5 minutes quickly talking about distinct film language, because my guess is that that might be new. Film borrows from theater in terms of staging, in terms of how set design is constructed, what color, how the set should look like. If you're creating a dystopic world, what principles should be employed to do that? So think of principles of design and architecture, for instance, and think about filmmakers really dealing with the question of space, time, and spatial narrative. So film is not just oral narration. Film is spatial and temporal narration. And by what I mean by that is film is using the space and film is using time. So a film might deal with 10 years, but the film is not 10 years long. The film is maybe 2 hour long. So the film is able to create ellipses through the use of editing, and it's able to really kind of convey meaning through this kind of like play between design, architecture, and through that it's able to deal with the question of space and time in a very different way. So one has to kind of understand what this language of space and time is. There are some film scholars who are working on the importance of production cultures. The book is not out yet. There's a film scholar called Carlos. I'm forgetting his last name, but he's worked on Indian cinema and he's interviewed over 200 production designers to talk about like how that adds meaning to what we understand from the text. So what kind of space does a character really occupy can also tell you a lot about spatially how that world is constructed. So, for instance, think about a film like The Matrix, where the blankness of space conveys the existential crisis for the character and it is able to deal with larger questions of free will. And think about a film like Barbie, on the other hand, which is using the synthetic, toyetic world in order to construct a world which is about choice and is problematic in many ways, but at the same time it is able to do that. So space and architecture and design can tell you a lot about film, and we need to pay attention to aspects like lighting, set design, color schemes used, makeup, costume, all of these things, which is together called mise en scène. So that's the film language that's used, and that's what I kind of want to focus on, that film has its own distinct language. Film is a language, and we need to be able to talk about film meaningfully and write about it once we know that camera, as opposed to the pen, it shows as opposed to telling you what it is. So films don't tell, films show. It's an old diktat in film: don't show, don't tell. Which means that the character doesn't need to say what they're doing, or there's no narrator telling you what is happening. The camera is doing the job of the narrator, the camera is doing the job of creating perspective, and we need to understand what that language is in order to engage in scholarship like that. So I would recommend thinking about like how framing is done. Film is really born from photography, experiments in photography. So things like illumination, saturation, contrast, color, placement, all of that can give you, for instance, an insight into a character psychology. And in a film like The Joker, you can think about how villainy and someone who's at the outskirts of like, or that the peripheries of society is represented through their, like, through the composition of the film. So if you want to do formal analysis, you need to pay attention to these questions of illumination, saturation, contrast, color, lighting. um, One of the strongest weapons that films use is lighting. So in the photograph that I'm put here, it's a screenshot. You see how the lighting is placed in such a way that you don't see the character's face, so that it evokes fear and mystery. Lighting can also be used to partially show you something in order to create a sense of either being trapped, or it can convey a sense of shadowy character. A bright lighting, on the other hand, can give you a very clear insight into how the character is thinking and operating and working. So if you're writing about films and if you're researching into films, you need to, and especially if you do textual analysis, you really need to understand how all of these things will then connect to your typical cultural studies training, and you can connect this film language and speak of film in that very specific way, and then connect it to those larger themes, so to say, and then take it kind of from there, right? And that's really important for us to keep in mind, because film ultimately is a technological art. It is rooted in science, it's rooted in experiments in science, which means that basically film was born out of photography, experiments in photography. It goes all the way to 1800s, but basically there was an attempt to create movement in photograph. How do you create movement in photograph? How are you able to capture movement in photograph? So the chemical processes and the photons of light that would create a photograph would also then allow us to think about how we can instead think of celluloid and sensors. So just for everyone's knowledge and those who are maybe not that well versed in film, when you move a photograph really quickly, what today we call 24 frames per second is the standard, but early films look different because they were using 18 frames per second. because they didn't know what is that exact time when we can kind of create a real life effect of actual movement. So think of it like a flip book, right? So when you flip the photographs really quickly, you actually feel like someone's moving. That's basically what film is. So the perpetual experience in creating a persistence of vision is what this is. For instance, when you move the images really quickly in succession, the viewer is able to kind of interpret the continuous movement as movement, and that's why moving image. Think of it. I tell my students, think of a ceiling fan. When the fan is off, you see the three blades, but when the fan is on, you just see a swirl. That's what film is. Film is the swirl, and the individual blades are photographs. So we need to really understand how this composition really works and how this movement creates a sense of modernity and haptic experience for an audience member sitting in theater. And that actually gave rise to a lot of work on what is called reception studies and audience studies, where film scholars were interested in doing research as to how the construction of the image on screen has an impact on audience, how they receive the message, and are they just passive or are they also active in creating meaning. So those questions. And then finally, I want to talk about two more things, which is that the camera work itself, the fact that the camera takes you closer to a subject, or the camera cuts between two things and you're able to understand what it is because it's able to manipulate. It can slowly take you to something, it can draw you out of something, it takes you in new locations in a very clever way. And the technique that is used is editing. And again, this is something you need to understand, that editing, for instance, is closely linked with ideology. So people who do research on propaganda, people who do research on ideology, people who do textual and discourse analysis on manipulation, fake news, those elements of film and media studies really need to verse themselves in how editing plays a role in constructing meaning. And since I had kept one or two clips to explain that, and now that I know that a lot of the people here are not teaching film or not necessarily well versed in the film language, I'm going to show that to explain what I mean by this. Film is basically pieces of puzzle that you need to then put together. The way film is shot is not written. You create pieces and then you basically just attach it so that it makes meaning, and it creates what's called continuity editing. So I'm going to show you an example of that. And an example of that goes all the way back to 1920s Moscow School, which was the first film school, first university which started teaching film, and the first university that started researching film. The Moscow School under USSR and during the time of the Russian Revolution, Lenin wanted to nationalize the film industry, and it led to production companies being dissolved, and the Moscow Film School started to understand how film can create meaning and how can one develop film theory. Does it align with, the tool set that one has? And one of the teachers there, who's the founder of film theory really, was a person called Lev Kuleshov. And what I'm going to show you now is an experiment that he did in his class. It's called the Kuleshov effect. And what he did was this. He created like 3 samples for his students, where he put images and the middle piece remained the same. The second piece always was the same. So the first image is one, and then the second image is the same. Third experiment. Again, first image changes and the second image is the same. So this experiment, any guesses what it's showing? Think of editing. Like the second piece remains the same in all 3 experiments, all 3 images, but the first one changes.
The emotion of the person in the second clip, which remains same.
Yeah.
But according to the first clip, we are interpreting it in a different manner.
Absolutely, absolutely. So context, the idea of editing, creating context and meaning, And also, like, if you think about today's world and people who work on do research on fake news, people who do research on manipulation of text, deep fakes, etc., they're looking at exactly this, that what is put in context, what is removed, and so that kind of has an impact on how we think about some of these larger questions. So whether you look at a bowl of soup, then you're thinking the person is probably thinking hunger. The moment you change what he's looking at with a coffin, maybe it reflects grief. Um, and the moment you replace that with a person, maybe it is can be interpreted as love or lust. So depending on what the piece is, you really start to interpret images like that. And this editing was really useful, and it still continues to be useful, not just because of today's world where we're looking at questions of fake news, but also historical documentation. Films were really popular among fascists. Hitler loved films, and he made a lot of documentary propaganda films. And the reason he could do that is because he saw film as a way to send his message, but he also knew how you can manipulate consent to people who don't necessarily will not probably pick up a book and read it, but they will watch a film and they'll watch these newsreels on buses, etc., or in villages where they were basically screened. And of course, Charlie Chaplin famously, in a film called The Great Dictator, satirizes that and creates a counter narrative. And on the other hand, there are films that in India, in a newly independent India, they tried to create a consensus on what nationalism in India is, which we are still debating. But we are so different from each other in terms of our language practices, in terms of our, uh, in, in terms of our, everything from eating practices to rituals to celebration of festivals, backgrounds. So in that context, it's really important for us to kind of keep in mind how films can also help create consensus. Is there a question? I see, I can hear something.
I think somebody has unmuted themselves, ma'am, without any reason. I'll try to find that person and mute him.
Okay.
Okay.
Sorry, I thought there's a question. Thank you. All right, so I'll now move to the final part of what I want to talk about, which is that we need to. So this is my key thing. One is that this is the traditional film research. So if you're interested in it, well verse yourself in film language. One book I highly recommend is Film Art by Bodwell and Thompson, who are the formal, like, they've written the foundational text that gives you the entirety of film language, and you can then use that and understand how formal analysis really work. And once you're well versed in film theory, film language, and that formal analysis of how to then use representational politics, history, philosophy, sociology, all of these elements, you'll be able to kind of engage with that kind of research. I now want to move to the second part of the research that I want to talk about, which is what is very relevant, especially for the kind of faculty development program that you've organized, which I saw, this multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary approaches, right? So even though I have to say that this is also in a way multidisciplinary, even film analysis is multidisciplinary because it's similar to literature where it draws on history, sociology, etc. So this is itself multidisciplinary, but we also need to understand film as as an industry. So film employs a number of people, everyone from makeup artists to hair artists to spot boys to musicians to actors to technicians, and of course, it has this paraphernalia. And that's what I meant by collaborative art. That one person can't really make a film. This just it'll be an experimental film basically. So films employ a lot of people. It's a fully fledged business. You need someone to finance it. You need someone to produce it. You need someone to act in it. You need someone to distribute it. You need someone to exhibit it. It contributes to the economy. It is guided by the market forces. It sells tickets and people go and buy it. Which means that what has happened in the last 3 decades of film studies is that when we think about research, we can't just look at the film language and film's textual analysis, because that just tells us one part of the story. It allows us to formally analyze the the nuances of storytelling. But storytelling is not divorced from the medium through which stories are told and the regimes within which it works. So what I mean by that is films in the last 30 to 35 years have seen a focus shift from textual and discourse analysis to production, distribution, and circulation, and understanding it as an industry and thinking about questions of labor, thinking about questions of distribution and how that impacts meaning. Why is this film, for instance, giving you a narrative where a Hindu man marries a Muslim woman and not the other way around? Or why is a narrative giving you a story of a young college going person, and why we have so few stories that deal with people in their 50s and 60s and so on? And the reason is it has a direct link with ticket buying potential of people. Filmmakers see audience as demographics, that, oh, these many people, these age groups come to the cinema hall, so let's tell their stories. So let's not forget that this medium and anything that we study, we can't understand its textual meaning without the context and without the extra textual. So what I've addressed so far is the textual, the theoretical, the language, and to a certain extent, the contextual, right? We need to also really understand the third key element, which is the extra textual, which is where a lot of the research methods in film studies come from. So I want to mention at this moment that film now, as a part of a larger media scape, as I've said earlier, cinematic media has become really popular, which means our television on platforms looks a lot like cinema. Video games are borrowing from film language. Social media is also using film. So film and film studies now as a discipline, in terms of its research potential and in terms of both subjects, themes, and methods, now has to incorporate the question of media conglomerates, interactive storytelling, synthetic and plastic materiality of AI, algorithms, things like that. So what we see on Netflix or Amazon, a media conglomerate is deciding and is monitoring and surveilling us and looking at our patterns and then giving us those options. So a lot of what we see now is also dictated by those terms. And film studies as a discipline has now started to take a more media studies approach. And by that, I mean that it is looking at these intersections of film, technology, um, and basically the shifts in the industry more seriously, and that is also informing a lot of the inter and multidisciplinary approach that you see in film. So this is what I want to kind of emphasize at this point, that film as a medium is not like supposed to just refer to other disciplines in a kind of standalone way. Films are taught in all these different areas. Design, there are design scholars who are also film scholars, there are economists who study film economy, there are people who are experts in urban or rural geographies who study film. There are people who study history and they use film, and they also write film histories. So for instance, silent film history. A lot of the silent film history doesn't even have the text. So how will you research an area where there's not even a text? And people who study silent cinema have been struggling with this for a long time, because India has a terrible history of maintaining its historical records and films. Also, films were initially analog, which means the reels were so heavy that not all of it was maintained. Some of it is destroyed in fires because nicotine, the strip itself is highly inflammable. So a lot of the film reels are not available to us, and therefore our silent film history and people who are film historians struggle with that as a research problem, which is how do you research in a discipline which was textual analysis, but if there's no text, what do you study? And what they do is they do what that's the actually moment of big turn in film studies, which is that you start to tell stories through the little textual information you have, but you use film magazines, you start to use newspaper archives, you start to do interviews, you start to look at secondary and primary data, and you start to kind of construct a film history which is not focusing on film text. So that's part of how we start to think about film studies beyond the text, but sometimes also incorporating the text. So all of these disciplines, law, Lawrence Liang writes on legality, piracy, and cinema. Then there's a lot of work on linguistics and sound design, sound studies. So recently, Pavitra Sundar's book on sound work talks about intonations, talks about gesture and all of that as part of the sound of the film. Music is studied separately, literature, politics, sociology, all of that. So film has the scope to incorporate ethnographic research, memory research, so memory studies, people who work on memory studies, social geography, urban studies, history. All of these disciplines can find its place in film studies because of the fact that it's a collaborative art and it requires everything from set design to makeup and artistry is part of that, but also technical, like editing is a great example of that. So all of this needs to be kind of thought through when you do a study in film. And I do want to point out, for instance, a couple of areas that do that, and then with a few examples as I enter the last 10, 20 minutes of my talk. An example of this is Ranjini Mazumdar's really foundational work on Bombay cinema and the archive of the city. Ranjini Mazumdar, who is also my mentor at School of Arts and Aesthetics in JNU. She's a very renowned filmmaker, documentary filmmaker, and film scholar. She she studied geography. She was a geography student, and then she went on to study in New York University at Tisch School. She studied film. And there she realized that, of course, her background in geography and her knowledge of film as a technological and haptic art form allowed her to think about cinematic city. So her work, Bombay Cinema, an Archive of the City, is a great example of a book that uses and fuses disciplines of geography with cinematic apparatus. She uses everything from set design to the camera work, how, for instance, Helen is constructed as the other woman in a lot of the popular Bombay cinema. She uses the discourses on urban regimes, modernity, and design, and links that with geography and cinema. So this is an example of a film scholar who delves into an interdisciplinary approach, draws on a lot of literature on Weimar cinema, including work by Walter Benjamin, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, his writings on the work of art in the age of technological reproduction, but also his Arcades project, his work on archiving, etc. She also draws on Susan Buckmore's and her work on Anne Kerkor's work on the mass ornament and the idea of surface culture and what does it mean, and draws on people like Miriam Hansen to kind of link geography with cinema. So if you are interested in thinking about questions that how do different disciplines kind of approach film, this is one great example of a person trained in geography and film fusing her interest and her knowledge of cartography and geography and drawing on some of the philosophical literature on modernism, modernity, and urban architecture in order to discuss the city and how the city of Bombay is represented in cinema. In fact, she says we should not use words like Hindi cinema because Hindi is language defined, but Bombay is defined by the geography and the space. And that's why I think a lot of film scholars, you'd notice, instead of saying Hindi, popular Hindi cinema, instead they refer to it as Bombay cinema, because Hindi cinema kind of can go beyond Bombay as well. And that also like kind of talks about the linguistic politics of understanding industries, and that sometimes language doesn't define industry. And there's a great work by two scholars, Akshay Kumar and Akshaya Kumar, and Hansen, who's basically written a lot on how Bhojpuri cinema is it cuts across state lines. So we can't even understand it in state. It's not regional. So regional cinema itself is a very problematic category that thankfully people like S.V. Srinivas and many others have questioned and kind of pushed that narrative further by looking at cinemas from parts of the country which are more complicated. So that includes people like Madhuja Mukherjee. My own work deals with that, but also others. So I just wanted to kind of signpost that. So films can be studied through multiple means. There are fields such as production studies, reception studies, industry studies, distribution studies, network studies, exhibition studies. People are not looking at film purely as a text, but rather through artifacts, labor, markets, networks. And one example among these, because of time frame, I mean, this research and methods in film studies is like a whole, people take 3-4 years to understand it. So it's very difficult to condense it for a 1 hour long discussion. So pardon me as I don't kind of have time to delve into all of that, but I want to give one example so that it becomes clear how each of these also has like so many layers that can be unpacked. So I'll give an example of production studies, for instance. This field really emerged in the last 20 years. John Caldwell's work on production culture is one of the first ones to talk about film, not textually, but also where the industry set up. Most big film industries are in port towns, and the reason is the film reel initially could really travel easily. These are big trading centers. That's why in India, the big centers for film production, if you notice, they're all like on the margins of they're always near the ports. Think about cities like think about cities like, of course, Mumbai, but also Goa, Chennai, think about Kolkata, all these like different regional, initially what was called like regional film centers, emerged in very specific city spaces, but also like thinking about questions of labor and cultural intermediaries, like who are the people who take films, who are the people who work on films, what are the labor practices. uh, Caldwell very rightly talks about below the line labor versus above the line labor, and he talks about the disparities. And you can basically do a Marxist reading of the ways in which film labor is exploited and think about how there's a whole set of like disparity there. So in film studies, for instance, we look at directors and actors. There's star studies, celebrity studies, auteur studies, which is very specific to film theory. Um, but we don't have people who are like stuntmen. There's very little work on that. People who act as extras or background dancers and things like that. So now I think some of those gaps are being addressed. I am working on some of those areas in the long term. But yeah, like there are very few, there's very little work, and that shows you there are enough research gaps for us to kind of think about. But also it gives you a sense of the scope of production studies. There are scholars that you see here, Vicky Meyer, Miranda Banks, Nitin Govil, Arisa Perrin, all of these people have dealt with industry at the center of the focus and said that let's not just do textual studies, let's just think about how these production spaces are coming up, and the kind of theoretical, historical and methodological kind of elements that we can take from that. So that's one example of the fields that I talk about. This last part, I want to focus on the different sides of sources that film studies borrows from. And I'm going to just hint at 2 or 3 for this talk, but there are many, many more. And I highly recommend that those of you who get interested in it or who are interested in it, look into that. So this is the last part of what I want to discuss. One of the most common methods used in film and film studies, besides textual analysis, which I've already addressed, is archival research. Archival research, I think, is very obvious. It draws on the archives as a key source of understanding the film history, film context, but also sometimes the text itself. My example of early cinema, I think, is a great way for us to think about why archival research is so important. When there's no text, archives sometimes can speak about that silence in a very profound way. So these are people who draw on everything from film magazines to film production materials, biographies of stars, to understanding how these films and stories and narratives were coming together. So there's a lot of work on early Bombay cinema. There's a lot of work on early cinema coming out of what was then Madras. There's a lot of now work being done on early Marathi cinema. So early cinema really, but not just early cinema, that's just one example, draws on archival research. So as you think about research, and if you are studying anything which is, whether it's recent or whether it is in the past, you might want to think about the archive as great kind of archival research as a method, but also archive as a great source for material. So think about, so at least in Pune, where I am based, is the National Film Archive of India, where they have film magazines, they have some film prints digitized now. They have old advertisements, they have the lobby cards that were put in theaters at the time of their release, and some of it has been donated, of course. There's some restoration projects being undertaken by Film Heritage of India. So there are organizations that do archiving and that have these archives, and they are open to public. There's a politics to archiving as well, which I don't have time to go into right now, but people who study the archives and they do that. So there are also a lot of digital archives. Also, do not discount newspapers as a key source of information. Every day in newspapers, you'll realize there's so many stories about films, and it just moves along. But those newspaper archives also become a very important source of production histories, of star histories, biographies, that are great sources for us to kind of think about film history, but also link film history with film sources. So that's one. The other kind of documents that you can consider when you do film research, and that can be a part of archival research. One, I've already mentioned, the newspapers. The other is the censor board documents. The other is the policy documents that the government has. So policy documents, censor board documentation, etc. This comes under like what is called political economy, right? Approach to film. I think some of the most recent research on film has gone beyond just a cultural studies approach, and they like to combine cultural studies approach with political economy, right? So if you're doing that, and there are film scholars like Kritika Kaushik, who has drawn on, for instance, 1980s Doordarshan and how they were using the state apparatus to construct the story of nationalism for a national audience, and how that had its gaps and problems, and so she draws a lot on, for instance, policy documents and this production footage from Doordarshan. So she went to the Doordarshan archives and newspaper archives and the state archives, the national archives, and combined all these with interviews and with materials, and then did a study of state documentaries. So you could study the documentary, you could watch the documentary and write about it, but when you do this kind of broad research, what you're allowing is you're allowing the historical realities of its time, its social, political, and economic realities, and questions of censorship, question of national construction of narratives on nationalism and identity, which are problematic in and by themselves, to be part of that story and then read the text in a very different way. So archival research is a very powerful method of doing film studies, and there are these two books that I thought I'll just mention. that highly rely on archival study. One book is an older book by Monica Mehta, where she looks at censorship and sexuality represented on screen. So she looks at the Indian Cinematograph Act, she looks at censor board documents, she looks at policy documents, and then she looks at publicity materials and film stills, and then does a film analysis. So she's combining those elements. Bombay Hustle, Making Movies in a Colonial City by Debashri Mukherjee is a early film history book. And that's a great example of, again, archival research. And for someone who does not have access to films themselves or has very little available, how does she construct the history of colonial film practices, especially in Bombay, and how hustle, in her own words, become a way in which one can kind of really think about how the production really took place. So this kind of book will fit into the category of production studies, but it's also film history. It is doing film analysis. This film is not doing film analysis so much, but she'll use certain scenes and sections and their descriptions and even scandals, and she'll use and incorporate all of this to create a sense of like visceral history of early cinema. So that's an example of doing archival history. The second thing I want to talk about, and I'm just going to talk about three things for this talk, and in another 5 minutes I want to wrap it up so that we have 15 minutes to discuss questions if you have any. Production material is another site which I've already talked about, but everything from film script to documentation that exists about how the film was made, who was hired, how long the shoot was, any kind of behind the scene look at the film, what its kind of regime of production was, and what were the choices that were made, will also inform film practices. And there are many examples of that, but I want to cite my own work as an example of this. So my work, I published a work many years back now on colorization of a historical classic film called Mughal-e-Azam. It's a very popular Hindi film, which is considered to be a classic. And I was studying why this film, because I was looking at film remakes in my own research, and I found that this film nobody wants to remake. Instead, there's a whole conversation around how we should not remake this film, and instead we should colorize this film. So that got me interested in the film's history, its production history, and the fact that the filmmaker wanted to color the film. And then what was the aesthetic choices and historical choices and technological choices of colorizing films in the 1960s. I was thinking, so I looked at film archives, I looked at Film India magazine and the announcement and the posters and the production stories about Mughal-e-Azam being constructed and how the aura of the film is constructed through those magazine narratives. I combined that by doing looking at newspaper archives and interviews with Indian Academy of Arts and Animation, which actually restored and colorized the film. And then I combined that with the publicity around it. And together, these three methods of research, this is what's called like mixed methods approach. I'm doing industry research, but I'm also looking at production histories, and I combine an archival history. So I combine all of these, and I'm able to construct the story of a film and its afterlife and its resurgence in recent past, and why that resurgence can only be understood once we understand what was happening in the 1960s. So there is this relationship between 2000s and 1960s, and I'm constructing that through archival research, production history, through that archival research, and combining that with interviews and publicity, etc., to construct and theorize the idea of film aura and remaking. So that's one example of how production materials and archives can be mobilized together. The last thing I want to talk about is ethnography, which is another very common research method used in film studies. Ethnography can include anything from it can include participant observation, going to a site again and again, speaking with people on those sites. It very often includes interviews, observations, photographs, and sorry. Can we take the questions in another 5 minutes? I'm just about to wrap up. Um, so ethnography is like part of that, and people actually who do quantitative data do ethnographies a lot, and for that they very often use questionnaires as well. So some of my colleagues at UT Austin were studying the representation of Latina women in television shows in the US, and for that they went to different neighborhoods in Texas and they took their questionnaires with them, distributed those questionnaires and collated material and created a data chart to understand how that could be done. So that's one other style of recording and using research. And ethnography in a cultural studies approach has, you use interviews and you go back to studios and you go to those spaces where things are being constructed. And an example of that is Tejaswini Kanti. She's working on dubbing artists. So she's been going to these different dubbing studios, speaking to artists, speaking to recording agents, speaking to the industry heads, speaking to trade pundits, and then looking at dubbed films themselves and together looking at studio histories of dubbing. So that's an example of ethnography playing a very important role in again, doing film research. Other examples I've listed here, Cut Pieces is by Lotte Hawk, who looks at how in Bangladesh action films are, there's these little bits of film that are inserted in action films and what kind of popular cinema is constructed through that. Karthik Nayar's very recent new book on horror cinema of Ramsey brothers in the 1980s. And he's used family archives, he's used interviews, first-hand interviews with the filmmakers and the publicity material and the film themselves to look at film genre from a film theory perspective, and together he's looked at the materiality of horror in that came out of 1980s Bombay cinema. And the third example here in the middle, Blake Atwood, he's written on Iranian cinema. And in Iran, very popularly after the revolution 1980s, films were banned and watching films became a concern in terms of the political reality of Iran at the time. And he, Underground, talks about a story of like suitcases and films being carried in suitcases and being screened for small audience quietly as a rebellion. So what he did was he visited these centers, he spoke to people, he visited all these spaces and interviewed people in depth, made observations, captured the equipment that was used, etc. And then he wrote an ethnography on Iranian cinema. And I want to end with how I've used ethnography recently in my work on Mollywood. This is my book project that I'm developing now, but I've already published a book chapter on this now 2 years back, and another chapter is coming out this month in South Asian popular culture. And basically, I'm looking at a small town in Maharashtra called Malegaon, and that town makes films, and it's a small town and it's mostly textile workers who are making films, and this town and this film practice has been called Mollywood. So my work looks at what does this Mollywood mean and how do we understand it in terms of film history, and how do we map a film culture which does not really have formal infrastructure. So I stumbled on this subject when I was looking at digital productions that remake traditional Bombay films, and I came across this documentary called Supermen of Malegaon in Delhi while visiting a film festival. And this film became really popular. It got a theatrical release in some sections of north of India. It's Faiza Khan's Supermen of Malegaon. And I started to study what this film culture was. And in order to do that, my inquiry was, what is the place of a culture like this in the large film culture in India? So I was obviously looking at the documentary film, and documentary film became a secondary material for me to look at. But if I was to write a story of Malegaon through somebody else's documentary, I am using their perspective and their documentary lens as a material. So this could only be a secondary material for me. You know, newspaper articles and documentaries were secondary material. What is the primary material I could look at? There is no archive in this case. So for me, the research method had to be ethnography, because this is not unofficial. These are all informal practices. So there is no archive. There is no film studio. There is no government keeping records or anything like that. So I had to actually go and meet these people, visit this town. I visited it 3-4 times already, and I'll go and visit it every year, because every year something is changing in that place. And that's part of doing research, is not to just get the information and come back and write it, but sometimes just going back again and again and finding the depth of it is really important. And this is what I want to end with, that I use ethnography in my work, and in the materials that I draw is not just ethnography. So if you see on the left, you see the handwritten script. It is all written in Urdu. The local newspapers in Malegaon, which publish stories about film releases. This is a board from a cinema hall, a video parlor in Malegaon, and right next to it is a similar small theater in Malegaon. And this is my interview with Akram Khan, who's a writer, editor in Malegaon, and I actually saw him editing a section of the film while I was there. So by doing this, by not just looking at the film text, but instead by looking at newspaper and TV archive, both English language and Urdu language coming from Malegaon, by looking at the text through the DVDs and the videos that are produced, through the interviews of film directors and artists and distributors who were distributing these films, using the documentary films and film festival reports that were talking about the Superman of Malegaon film, looking at the policy document on development in Malegaon area and the lack of theaters, by looking at the production materials like the script, etc. And then I took a number of photographs. I was actually able to encapsulate what this film practices and really meaningfully create, hopefully, a film history which is interdisciplinary but also multi-sided. And that's the importance of doing field work that goes beyond the text. And I hope that this very small but also very extremely condensed section on film studies as a field, its evolution and its multiple potentialities of intersections with other disciplines, but also different research methods. I hope it gives an insight to you as to the scope of the field. And yeah, I'll stop here because I want to leave 10-15 minutes for any thoughts or questions. So yeah, that's it. I'm gonna stop sharing this. Yes. All right.
Non-mute. Yeah, ma'am.
You're audible now.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you to the world of film studies.
No, thanks. I was in two minds as to how much to cover, and then I think just looking at the basics, I thought like let me cover the full ground, and then we can always zoom in. And I think faculty who are interested will have enough to kind of do their own research and kind of delve into the possibilities of the field. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, they have a question.
Sure.
Priya, ma'am, you
Nam-
can ask the question, ma'am.
Namaste, ma'am. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. Ramna, ma'am, that was really a wonderful presentation, and you gave us such a panoramic view of the entire picture of cinema studies. I thank you very much for that, ma'am. And some of my scholars are pursuing, take PhD, and for that they have taken film as the text. And in this connection, some of my colleagues are of the opinion that if you are doing cultural studies or gender studies or any ordinary studies that we generally do in English literature, why take film as text? So if you are taking film as text, then it is mandatory that you look at the filmographic specificalities. Ma'am, is it a compulsory? I mean, is it mandatory that we should?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and this is one of the reasons why I wanted to kind of talk about how the field itself has evolved, because that scholarship still has some place, but I have to say that if you want to not just create a publication and instead create scholarship, and if you want to create meaningful scholarship and discourse in the field, then it is really important that you need to understand the intricacies of the art form. I'm not a filmmaker, and I want to clarify that I don't expect somebody to go and learn filmmaking. In fact, I don't think I'll be good filmmaker maybe, but I teach people. I'm the first person through whom they learn the intricacies of film as an art form. But I do think that with not learning film's basic language and basic tenets and its understanding as a technological aesthetic art form is like not knowing the alphabet and then learning poetry. You need to learn the alphabet, and then with an alphabet, once you know the language, you can write poetry, you can write a novel, you can write a play. It's you have the whole world open to you, and then you can also subvert the language. In post-colonial writers like Walcott have done that. They deliberately use the language of the colonial master to subvert it. So I think cinema also does that, but cinema's language is different. So if we don't know that language, then I think what it does is that it dilutes our understanding of the potentialities of the medium, its history, and its complexity. And I think that you don't need to go very deep. I think basic film appreciation course. So when I went to MPhil, and that's why I presented my history in the very beginning, because when I went to JNU, I was a literature student, and I had to sit for classes in masters, even though I was an MPhil student. I went for masters classes where introduction to film was being taught. We were told to attend those classes so that we can actually know how to write in our MPhil seminars, which were research seminars. So we were doing double the work in a way. We were kind of doing masters again in a way, not entirely, but like a few courses, so that we learn that language. And I feel like if your students are really interested in film, then whether it's a film appreciation course, whether it is just a history of film course, whether it's just reading a book like Film Art by Bodwell and Thompson, they need to know that language to meaningfully engage with the field. That's my opinion. And I think that to also like engage in the film not through the peripheries, but in a, like I said, in a meaningful way, that's important, I would say. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, ma'am. Thank you.
Kavita, ma'am.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Good morning, Dr. Ramna. That was a fantastic talk. Actually, it was like, you were giving a frame by frame, comprehensive look into the research methodology that involved in film studies. That was a great talk, and I would like to, and as you said, in 1 hour, it's definitely not possible. But I definitely like a word from you that we'd be interested in inviting you for a workshop. I think that will be very interesting. There are quite a few scholars who are doing in film studies, so that will definitely help them. And I have a question today that is not exactly films, but it is short films. So one of my scholars is looking at doing research in short films, gender-based. She selected 6 films, but I just want to know how are the theories that you've just now listed out, or a regular film, are the same theories applicable to these, or how is it? What kind of method should we take it up to make it a really good? Because it's a comparison between the POSH policy and the short films, which are related to POSH policy.
Right.
So I would like, yes, a little bit of light into that.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. So I think broadly speaking, film theory applies to all sorts of film. It's not just fiction film, but I have to say film studies broadly has focused a lot on fiction films or documentary films. And for our look at documentary films, we've really kind of thought about questions of ideology more head on. So I would suggest to your student, depending on the films that they've taken, clearly gender is a key element that they want to study. So I would highly recommend that they look at feminist film scholarship and feminist film theory. And they are edited volumes of that, but Laura Mulvey is a great start. And there's a lot of work being done on linking questions of policy, labor, and film. And I think that triage might be really useful for your students to kind of think about doing a kind of mixing maybe textual study with with productions history, but also like the industrial history. So short films, for instance, I'm guessing travel a lot in film festivals. So there are people who worked on film festival circuit as a site, and there's a lot of documentation that one can kind of look into for short film study. So the sites will change. There might not be a lot in newspapers, for instance, but you will find different sites for inquiring into those areas, which will be film festival circuits. It'll be short film circuits. Again, there are festival reports that are created. Maybe one can look into that. One should definitely look at state policy documents and any kind of controversial news, for instance, that has come up with regard to the policy, and use those newspaper archives, the policy documents, the maybe festival reports, and then combine it with feminist film theory, and then kind of give a like a kind of look at it in a more comprehensive way through those different lenses combined. So depending on what you are studying, your site of research will shift. Like I didn't have archive as a site, and I'm guessing this student will might not also have an archive as a site, but she can reach out to the filmmakers and do first-hand primary interviews. She can create a questionnaire for an audience where these films are taken. So there are many ways and many different methods that can be employed for something like this.
Even ethnography can be a point. Is it?
But if she's looking like 5, 6 films, but I think more, I'm thinking more like interviews, because I'm guessing ethnographic like sites will shift because of number of texts she's looking at. So maybe combining textual analysis through film theory, feminist film theory, but combining that with interviews with filmmakers, and looking at festival reports and newspaper archives could, I mean, I'm just thinking, I've not looked at the details of the project, but this is what I'm thinking for something like this. But yes, film theory would apply irrespective, because construction and composition and framing and the story construction is done in a very similar way, irrespective.
And one technical doubt, that is, see, when we take literature, we have 4 to 5 novels, or if we have movies, we have again 4 to 5 movies. But when we talk of short films, how many short films would suffice the requirement to
Yeah,
do
so
this?
I think it depends. So in quantitative studies, the number needs to be higher, especially if someone's looking at questionnaires and doing surveys, then that number can't be very low because it doesn't become a good sample size. But if there's a humanistic cultural studies approach, I would say at least 3 examples is, I would say, good, because basically in qualitative analysis, we are still looking at patterns, but 2 is too small a sample and 4 is too huge sometimes to kind of analyze unless it becomes a detailed report, in which case you can look at 4, 5 films. But if it is more like a condensed shorter research project, then I would say at least 3, so that you can observe and theoretically pull the framework through multiple texts, and 1 will be too selective, 2 will be too comparative, and I think 3 will be a good kind of balance in that sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
We have actually taken 6 short films, but all are very strong ones. So we didn't want to leave anything.
How many chapters maybe would come out of it?
We've just started. We're just looking at 6 chapters.
Oh, then I think then it's absolutely very much a
This
good.
one, the first and last will be the regular introduction and
Yeah,
conclusion.
yeah. For a larger project, it can't be
Yeah.
just 2, 3 films. In fact, it has to be more. So that's a good that works for a longer project for sure.
Oh.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, and I'd definitely like to be in contact with you related to this thing.
Definitely, definitely. We have another question. I see another hand. Jenilyn? I can't.
Hello, ma'am. Am I
Yeah.
audible?
Yes. Yes.
Ma'am, my mic is not working. I wanted to ask this, ma'am. I'm doing it on dystopian film. I have dystopian films, and I've taken 3 trilogies. So, but I've heard that it is a lot to do taking 3 trilogies as primary sources. So it comes around 9 films, ma'am. So what would be the right number of films to
What is your project about?
surveillance in dystopian literature, ma'am?
Surveys?
Surveillance. How?
Surveillance.
Yeah.
Um,
The,
you know,
the right.
yeah, like, it really depends on how you break down your chapters, really. Like, if you're looking at a larger project, 8 or 9 is also not large enough, because if you have like 5 chapters and in each chapter you're looking at two case studies at least, or one case study in detail, 2 case studies in detail, then you are able to pull that thread through the entire dissertation. So I think I always choose a text which most kind of fits the theoretical framing, but also where I know I'll find richness of sources, right? So you when you have to make that choice, just make sure that some things can also just be anecdotal and part of your opening paragraph. Some stories can go in your conclusion, and some stories can just be hinted at and mentioned, as opposed to everything being explored. So I would suggest that look at your material and think about how much do you have to say about each of these films, how much material can you excavate on each of these elements, and then maybe some films just need to be benchmarked, and some films just need to be an opening anecdote through which then you talk about the larger narrative, and some films can just bring your argument to a close as a way of saying, like, look, there are others that are doing something very similar, I'm going to focus on this. So I would suggest that you look at the density of material you have, and then how you're able to kind of really engage with it and come to that point where you're able to justify your choice of case study based on your larger kind of argument.
Yes, ma'am. So the density that you said, like how much should like if I'm taking if I'm reviewing a film, so how much value of surveillance should it have in one film to take
It's not,
to
yeah,
consider?
it's not measurable. Unfortunately, in cultural studies and humanities, there's no measure. But I
Yes.
will tell you, it really depends on how strong theoretical framing is. And I want to give an example. Like, there are film scholars who just study a scene in a film. But what they do with that scene is they really kind of, keep peeling the layers more and more. Ultimately, think of your research not as width, but as depth. And think about how many layers can you kind of reveal when you do the research. So you can look at 5 examples, but can you look at one example that has all those 5 layers, right? So I think it's immeasurable, and it is very difficult to answer your question objectively. But think about those nuances, and think about those layers, and think about how it ties with your theory, and you'll be able to kind of answer a question like that. Like, I wrote a piece on film remakes. I use Devdas as a single text, but that film has been remade in multiple versions, and I use those multiple versions then as example of how layered that text is. So I didn't have to, I mentioned many other films, but I could just use that as an example, and then I moved to my second case study to show a different variation of it. And that's all that was required. So I would suggest, when you're stuck like this, I would suggest read work of scholars, look at their bibliography, look at their case studies. Existing research is the best way for us to assess the matrix of good research. So the more you read, the more your language will also enhance, but also you'll be able to understand how much depth one can kind of unwrap in a text.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
You're welcome.
Thank you, ma'am. Am I audible now?
Yes, yes.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for the wonderful session. Even we know, even those who don't have the idea of film studies, I think now they have the idea how to go about the research and film studies.
Yes. True.
Ma'am, Michael sir has a question for you if you have.
Yeah, I have 5
It's in
minutes.
the chat box. I'll
Okay.
read it for you.
Yes.
It's how do we convert the visual style and film language into a formal language in research thesis?
Okay. So I think again it goes back to understanding the film language. So for instance, one can have a whole chapter on lighting, but when you're really doing a formal analysis, so for instance, one of the tasks my students do is they do a short breakdown and they study point of view. So they break a scene down into how many times the camera has changed position and how many times are you getting over the shoulder shot, or when a character is looking, the camera cuts and shows what they're looking at. So that's an example of the camera privileging a character's point of view. And in that sense, what the students are doing is they are using the language of cutting, which is a technical term, point of view, which is another technical term, uh, glance object cut, another technical term, but they use all of this and they combine all of this to talk about motive, and they talk about plot favoring like this one character's point of view, and how gender construction is important in how the story moves along. So visual style and film language gives you the ability to think about questions of perspective, representation in a more nuanced way. Similarly, male gaze, for instance. So think about item songs, what are called item songs. I'm putting that in quote. How the camera tracks a woman from bottom to top, and that's a clear indication of male gaze. But the camera and its use of slow motion, the camera's use of what is called tilt up. Now, tilt up is a technical term, but by using the term, the camera tilts up to reveal the long shot of the subject, that is you using the film language to talk about something which links to representation, right? So these are some examples of how visual language and film language can then be in turn used for analysis. And what I tell my students is don't describe what's happening in the scene, analyze it. So don't just say this person is wearing this costume. You can just say her flowing gown represents her freedom and her ability to take on the world or whatever. Like you need to connect. You don't need to just mention mention the visual cues and then move along. It's not for description, it's for analysis. So I think that's kind of an example of how you pull visual language, and it's very easy. Again, if you take a class on introduction to film or film appreciation, a course that I teach my students, where we basically learn not just to say that this character's framing. So we talk about framing, we talk about lighting, we talk about placement, but in your larger analysis, you're just drawing on that to talk about your larger like argument about construction. So if you're saying a person is constructed as passive, how will you show they are constructed as passive? You can just say that the camera shows them at a distance. There are no intimate like close-ups. You can talk about how the camera frames them and objectifies them by framing them on the corners of the screen. So there are many ways in which you can do it. And the more film language and visual style you understand, the better you'll be able to integrate that.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for answering each and every question with clarity, giving ideas. Thank you so much for that. I
Thank you.
think and through your session, we are introduced to the art and science behind this film studies, research on movies and its evolution, methods of research. You have elaborated on various types of research, the depth of your knowledge and the clarity with which you conveyed complex ideas made the session both engaging and enlightening. The session has ignited a deeper curiosity and appreciation for film studies in all of us. On behalf of the department, I thank you once again for sharing your time, knowledge, and passion with us today. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you. It was lovely talking about something I do. And thank you for inviting me, and thanks for creating this forum. And I hope some of the students can benefit from this, and faculty.
Sure, ma'am, sure.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. I thank all the participants and I request you all to join for the next session, the last session at 2 p.m. today. Thank you. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Bye, ma'am.
Bye.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, coordinators. Thank you very much for giving us
Yes,
wonderful
sir.
session.
Thank you, sir.